to this Rural Health Seminar series for 2022. My name's Jo Longman. I'm a Senior Research Fellow based here at the University Centre for Rural Health. And these Rural Health Seminars are a collaboration between the University Centre for Rural Health and the Northern New South Wales Local Health District and Southern Cross Uni. So I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands and waters on which we are meeting today. And we would like to pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. And to acknowledge any Aboriginal and or Torres Strait Islander people who are joining us today. So a bit of quick Zoom housekeeping. So if you could please keep your microphone muted, that would be helpful. And I do want to let you know that the seminar is being recorded. And we will be loading up this as a podcast onto our UCRH website. There will be time for questions for Sarah at the end of the presentation. So if you have any questions, please do feel free to use the chat function, or you could unmute your microphone and ask a question directly. And I do just want to make sure that everyone has this date in their diary, which is our next UCRH seminar, which is on the 20th of October this year. It's being presented by Dr. Monica Short and Robin Fitzroy, and it's about cooperative inquiry, so an innovative research approach accessible to all in academia and industry. So I'm really looking forward to hearing a bit more about that very creative and productive way of working. So on to today's seminar. It gives me a huge amount of pleasure to introduce our wonderful colleague to you, Dr. Sarah Bernays. Sarah is an applied anthropologist. She's focused on adolescent health and infectious diseases. Sarah conducts qualitative research to inform intervention design and conduct process evaluations within complex trials to understand the hows and the whys underpinning an intervention's effects. Her research aim is to enhance the influence of communities to shape interventions and policies which are going to work for them. Sarah's collaborative research programme primarily focuses on HIV and mental health in Southern Africa, as well as person-centred care to TB and COVID-19 in Vietnam. Sarah adopts innovative participatory approaches to engender more equitable engagement in research processes and to redress inherent power imbalances embedded within global health. So Sarah, it's my delight to welcome you today and thank you so much for coming to talk to us. Sarah's talk is entitled Community Resilience in the Face of Adversity. What makes it, what breaks it? Examining the contributions and limitations of community-based HIV peer support to adolescents' wellbeing in Southern Africa. So thanks so much, Sarah. I'll stop sharing my screen now if you want to share your screen.
Thanks very much. We appreciate it. If you could let me know if that is in the main view, that would be great. Okay, thank you everybody. Thank you so much for having me and inviting me to speak today. So I'm going to jump straight into the talk, and I hope that there'll be time afterwards for discussion. We can see where this takes us. So it's been quite a few months, really, or maybe more accurately, it's been quite a serious year or two or three. And the challenges that we face are global in nature and existential in proportion. And the 2022 UN Development Programme Special Report details a pattern of disasters which are both exhausting and scary. And the report describes an existential human crisis with fear, mistrust, and apprehension rising globally. And while it's global in that it's a pattern with very few places protected, it is felt in a very local and acute way. And we are observing ourselves even feeling that the enormity of the challenges posed by climate change, emerging infectious diseases, alongside economic crises, conflict and forced migration, are putting substantial pressures on our mental health globally. And whilst this has a clinical impact on mental health and can be pathologized to varying extents, it may be an indication that we are actually paying attention, because being anxious about the state of the world is a rational response. However, accompanying this is an emerging recognition of a burgeoning need to provide preventive and supportive mental health interventions at a widespread scale. In many, if not most settings, the need is such that it cannot be met with our current diagnostic and treatment capacity, and it may not be feasible or appropriate to do so. And given that the need and scale is beyond what we've been able to deliver to date, we need to adapt our available services as the needs grow. So there's increasing attention being turned to identifying and devising interventions which support individuals and communities to cope and to develop and protect community resilience. How to support people to keep going in contexts of intersecting difficulty, and what supports communities to cope, what might help communities even be part of changing the nature of that problem, has been a long-standing research interest of mine, especially where resourcing for mental health is limited. As Jo said, my research focuses on the interplay of infectious disease risk, in particular HIV, but also tuberculosis and COVID-19, with mental health. I'm interested in designing with communities responsive interventions which have a mutually mitigating effect on infectious diseases and on mental health. So in practical terms, in adolescent HIV, for example, essentially we've shown that if you improve mental health through the provision of psychosocial support, you reduce the risks of HIV acquisition and improve HIV treatment outcomes. So well-being shapes physical health, but it also highlights the need to make structural changes to the broader conditions which make individuals and communities vulnerable. So much of my talk today will be quite conceptual, but my objectives are applied. How can we devise interventions with communities that enhance their mental health and which may also serve to meet broader public health goals? So how do we create enabling environments for more equitable and positive health outcomes? Before I move into the main part of my talk, I wanted to explain my approach. So when I was thinking about what aspects of my current work to talk about in this webinar, I was conscious of the enormous trauma and ongoing challenges that are being faced here in the Northern Rivers community today. My research, though, tends to focus on Southern Africa, where I've been working continuously for the last 12 years or so, and have actually just come back from after a long hiatus of no international travel. And there they're facing distinct challenges of drought, economic turmoil, pandemic pressures. And I appreciate that this might feel very far away from here right now. But as my area of expertise per se is not here, I want to draw out where I can some potential constructive learnings and reflections from my work that might be useful for thinking about how we can support the coping and strengthening of mental health responses in local communities. And I think that while the challenges and responses may be localized, there are still distinct patterns in their effect. That, in my view, means there is a lot that can be learnt by reading across and between local contexts. So I hope that what I'll talk about today has some pertinence for you, but I'm really keen to listen to and learn from your knowledge and find ways that we can extend the productiveness of this conversation by learning from you. So I'm going to use the following questions to guide the structure of my talk. I'll start by having a go at defining what community resilience is. Then, using 2 case studies from my own research, I'll look at what it can do, identifying within each case study what makes it, i.e. what supports the development of and sustains community resilience, and then concurrently what breaks it or damages it. And I'll wrap up by bringing together some more conceptual reflections on what we can learn from this insight into community resilience for public health more broadly, and how we can apply that to some of the major challenges that we face today. So we've heard a lot about community resilience in recent years in relation to the pandemic, in relation to fires and droughts and floods. And our relationship to whether we think it's a useful concept depends a lot on our experiences and situations. It is spoken about within communities, by politicians, by the media, by academics. But what does it mean? In a helpful systematic review, Sunny Patel and colleagues explain that the concept of community resilience is almost invariably viewed as positive, being associated with increasing local capacity, social support and resources, and decreasing risks, miscommunication, and trauma. And they identify 3 broad categories of definitions in which, depending on one's stance, community resilience can either be seen as an ongoing process of adaptation, or the simple absence of negative effects, so an outcome, or thirdly, the presence of a range of positive attributes. So I'm going to try and break this down a little bit further. So in terms of it being a process, a definition which is increasingly adopted within more recent publications, this definition has come from Norris and colleagues a while back, who defined community resilience in a fairly tongue-twisting way, and I'm going to have a go, as a process linking a set of networked adaptive capacities to a positive trajectory of functioning and adaptation in constituent populations after a disturbance. But contrasting to this first type of definition, Gibson, in a paper exploring the 2009 Victorian bushfire in Australia, articulate the outcome-focused definition, which is that resilience is a demonstrable outcome of a capability to cope with uncertainty and change in an often volatile environment. And this notion of community resilience as an outcome was further adapted by others who noted the importance of specifically identifying and strengthening abilities in a community, creating a third type of definition, the range of positive attributes definition, as communities and individuals harnessing local resources and expertise to help themselves in an emergency in a way that complements, for example, the response of the emergency services. So inherent within the definition that we adopt is what we think the goal is. A lot of work in community resilience has focused on response to crises with an assumption that the emergency is an aberration and that there can be a return to normal. For example, a great deal of the focus of community resilience currently is based within communities' response to climate-related disasters. But what if there is no likely return to an endpoint of normal? The focus on chronic illness may be useful here. In the case studies that I'm going to go on to talk about, the community resilience that emerged was in response to a need to adapt to a changed future. And this was often taking place in a context where broader systems and structures were absent. And they did this by fostering new pathways of support and care within the community. So the way that we think about chronic illness can be constructive, because resilience in this way of thinking points to the uncertainty of the future. And the question is, if not a return to normal, then what? And by inference, how? So the goal in this framing is about adapting to transformed conditions and in turn potentially transforming that adapted experience. So it's about change, not assuming there's a return to the former status quo. So the definition of community resilience that I'm going to be thinking with is about it as a process and aligning with the Australian Government's Social Inclusion Board definition, which is outlined on the slide, and essentially says community resilience means the capacity of communities to respond positively to crises. It is the ability of a community to adapt to pressures and transform itself in a way which makes it more sustainable in the future. Rather than simply survive the stressor or change, a resilient community might respond in creative ways that fundamentally transform the basis of that community. So that's the definitions, and now I want to go on to what it can do. I'm going to talk through two case studies focused on adolescents in Southern Africa who are dealing with ongoing crises, a series of intersecting shocks. I'm thinking about interventions which use peer support to integrate young people into supportive social networks to foster resilient communities, which in turn help them to live well and are protective of their mental health. The first case study, called Jandiri, is a peer support intervention originating in Zimbabwe, which aims to help young people respond and adjust to the shock of an HIV diagnosis, and to support them to live well with HIV as a manageable chronic condition. I've been working with them for the last decade, and this evidence-based intervention has created an established and strong community of adolescents living with HIV through the provision of ongoing peer-delivered psychosocial support. And the second case study is called Lending a Hand. This is a far more nascent peer support intervention which we're trialing in South Africa and Uganda. With communities and partners, we've been developing it over the last 5 to 6 years. And the focus is on reducing the harms and risks young people face, for example, around HIV risks, substance use, violence, and exploitation when they arrive as migrants into new towns. So I'm going to dice with technology challenges here by trying to show you a short film which explains a bit about Jandiri before I go on to kind of unpack a bit more about why it works and how it fosters resilience. So let us see how we go.
This is Anesu. She was born with HIV. Fortunately, she has access to life-saving antiretroviral medicines. However, Anesu and the 1.7 million adolescents living with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa are less likely to survive compared with adults living with HIV. Furthermore, these adolescents are more likely to have poor mental health.
Sarah, is it just the slide?
In
Is it just the sound, or is there meant to be a picture?
Adolescents living with HIV in Zimbabwe told us they needed more than medicines to thrive.
How we can sort that. Sorry, everybody.
We're just getting the sound, Sarah. We're not getting a picture.
Okay, let me just see if there's a way of resolving.
Sarah, I think if you rejoin, and when you will be joining again, you'll have to tick a box that will say that you'll also share video.
Okay, can I just try this and see if you can you see that video, that green? Can you see that now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay.
This is Anesu. She was born with HIV. Fortunately, she has access to life-saving antiretroviral medicines. However, Anesu and the 1.7 million adolescents living with HIV in sub-Saharan Africa are less likely to survive compared with adults living with HIV. Furthermore, these adolescents are more likely to have poor mental health. In 2004, children and adolescents living with HIV in Zimbabwe told us they needed more than medicines to thrive. In response, Jandiri connects young people living with HIV with trained and mentored peer counselors who are also living with HIV, who understand and respond to their needs and experiences. This is Vimbai, a Jandiri-trained peer counselor. She connects with her young clients in the clinic, in their homes, in support groups, and through digital platforms, providing counseling and linking them with the services they need. We support governments to establish systems for embedding peer counselors. We then support them to recruit young people living with HIV who are aged between the ages of 18 to 24, who are then trained and mentored as peer counselors. These peer counselors are connected with their clients, and these are other children and adolescents living with HIV, who they then provide with counseling and linking them to the services they need. The result is health, happiness, and hope for young people living with HIV. Program data and 3 randomized control trials confirm young people in Jandiri are more likely to get tested, more likely to start HIV treatment, 42% more likely to have viral suppression, and have a 60% reduction in symptoms of poor mental health. We help governments adopt and deliver Jandiri through customized technical assistance, which is delivered on-site and remotely. At the beginning of 2022, Jandiri has been adopted in 11 countries with over 3,000 peer counselors who are supporting 96,000 young people. Our vision is to continue to scale Jandiri to reach 1 million young people in 20 countries by 2030.
Let me see if I can find a way back to my slides. Okay, can everyone see that slide again? And can you hear me all right?
Yeah, all good.
Great, thank you. Okay, so as they mentioned in the film, there have been 3 RCTs, randomized controlled trials of Jandiri. I led the qualitative work in the Jandiri trial and the more recent Jandiri Friendship Bench trial. And it's great that we know now that it works. And over the last 5 years, through the qualitative work, we've been trying to work out why. And what we're trying to do actually is quite unusual, because once we know something works, we tend to focus on scaling it up and implementing it, not necessarily going back all that often and trying to work out why. So 2 key explanations are that firstly, the peer support network creates a connected community with people who were previously socially isolated. And secondly, the likelihood of having a healthy future is made more real through the role models who provide peer support. And what I'm working on now in a current grant is distilling further the characteristics or ingredients of the process, the mechanisms of impact, to identify how to measure its presence and then use that understanding to further strengthen the intervention. And our emerging hypothesis from this recent work identifies the following mechanisms of impact, kind of what makes it. So the first is that peer connection displays and endorses a form of previously absent social approval, which provokes a recalibration of individual self-worth. This social connection enables not only increased self-acceptance, but also is a joyful experience and motivates young people to persevere and keep going with managing their HIV condition as part of a valued member of this peer community. Having these positive relationships fosters a sense of confidence in the community and in themselves. And this allows for the development of an alternative, powerful narratives of action, which enable a tangible hope for their future. And in turn, this produces energy and momentum for an ongoing individual investment, which sustains the community in this continual intervention. And I guess it's important to note that this intervention doesn't stop for individuals within the community when things get better. It continues. And I would argue that these are indicators of a resilient community where there is potential to adapt to altered conditions, and in time, a move to redefine what it means to live with HIV, which suggests that there are elements of a transformation of those conditions. To give you some kind of more concrete examples of this, in a recent focus group discussion that we conducted while I was in Zimbabwe with some young people living with HIV from the LGBTQI community, which is a group experiencing intense intersecting stigma, they talked about the effect in the following ways. One of them talked about how after coming to Jandiri, I can understand myself through other people's stories. Another talked about how in coming to a space where I'm finding HIV positive people, LGBTQI community, and people that experience similar problems as mine, and that they are surviving, thriving, and working on being better people despite HIV and all. And then this quote that I thought was particularly powerful: Jandiri built me mentally, and now I can stand for myself so that if I face challenges, I am not alone. But what breaks it? The mechanisms of impact that I have tentatively outlined are protective to some extent when negative events occur, but they don't confer immunity. So we've been doing ongoing qualitative longitudinal research with individuals part of the Jandiri community. And what the research reflects is that they are in very challenging situations. We have found that the impact of the intervention over time helps individuals to cope, but there are times when they struggle. And this is reflected in poor mental health, mistreatment doses, and higher viral loads. They may be more likely to get back on track with the support of the intervention, but their situations are dynamic, not static. We also notice the challenges that peer supporters themselves face in continuing ongoing support, and how being within these situations themselves as peer supporters going through something similar, and the gravity of the situation, it risks them burning out. So there's a lot of support being provided to prevent this within Jandiri, and we're doing a lot of research around it, but it's an acknowledged concern to which the intervention is being designed to better respond to. So these young people might be doing really well, but then they disclose their HIV status to a partner, for example, and it may go badly, which can prompt major problems for them. Or the impact of HIV may have been ameliorated, but they're still exposed to the consequences of poverty, bereavement, limited education and employment opportunities, due to economic conditions of their context. So the chronic nature of their condition and the challenges of their ongoing context means that maintaining viral suppression is a constant challenge. And when we were conducting the process evaluation of the Jandiri trial, we used the metaphor of it being like scaling a mountain to achieve viral suppression. But upon learning more over time, we've kind of needed to extend this metaphor to tackling a mountain range. And it highlights that the peer support helps with coping, and it may change the narrative of living with HIV, but it doesn't necessarily change the broader environment and structural conditions of risk for their mental health. I'm going to move on to the second case study now, which is lending a hand. And the community here are young migrants who've recently arrived in small urban settlements in Uganda and South Africa. And through their migrant identity, they're distinct from the broader community. So to recap, this is a peer support harm reduction intervention, which we've developed with communities and is a product of a 6-year process. So initially through formative research, we identified the particular risks facing this group. And then through a co-design process, we developed the intervention, Lending a Hand, in which peer supporters from the community are trained to support other young migrants, to advise and counsel them, to support them in engaging in less harmful behaviours if feasible, and connect them to healthcare, including HIV testing and treatment. And we also work with local employers to support these young people engaging with the intervention to navigate potential employment opportunities. And we've been conducting a feasibility study for the last 2 years, which unsurprisingly has been hugely impacted by the pandemic. And we've been trying to deliver a hybrid model of in-person and virtual support, including the use of a toll-free phone number to access support. And an aim of the study has been to identify soft indicators of resilience and mechanisms of impact within this community. So we're really early in our analysis of our findings, but in trying to distill whether and why it has an effect, our data suggests that there's an important relationship between being seen and feeling supported. As young migrants, often visibility is feared as it can lead to discrimination. So to be positively identified as a migrant and that be a route to being helped constitutes a constructive visibility. And they describe that having their risks and needs recognized is also validating. Key to what motivates them to participate in the intervention and binds them into a form of peer community is the trust that they have in the peer supporters. Given that they're cautious or suspicious even about engaging in services, trusting the peer supporters encourages them to seek out advice and engage in healthcare services, for example, HIV testing, accessing contraception, or seeking care for the symptoms of an STI. They talk about feeling more confident in managing, knowing that they can contact a peer supporter for advice, and that they know this is a community network which they've come to trust. It acts as a safety net which is protective, both in terms of potential events, but also protecting their imagined futures and not fearing being alone. Trust, though, is hard-earned and easily lost. The restrictions of the pandemic slowed down the development of these trusted networks, as just after the intervention began, being able to move around the community and meet with people became severely curtailed. And the demonstration that the peer supporters were worthy of being trusted, therefore, took a lot more time. Secondly, and not dissimilar to the Jandiri case study, the socioeconomic conditions are very difficult for young people, with poor economic conditions exacerbated by the pandemic, increasing exposure to not having enough food, limited healthcare access, increased reliance on survival sex and substance use. So they're exposed to more risks. It's essentially far more to weather. And thirdly, the communication infrastructure that we put in place has been weak. The toll-free number is really temperamental, and a young person might meet a peer supporter and later call the number that they've been given to speak to them again, but the number is down. So if trust was only nascent in the first place, this threatens it, and they're not going to call again. So if it rests on trust, yet the infrastructure to support it is weak, it renders that trust very fragile. So what I want to do now in moving into the final section of my talk is to take a step back and to reflect on what we can learn from these two case studies on emerging community resilience for public health. In both cases, we see that while interventions focused on supporting community resilience may help people cope, it may not resolve the need for communities to have to cope. So this poses the question, Is it just, as a mental health intervention, a band-aid to get people through periods of acute risk? Or can it be part of broader solutions to mitigate the problems that people are coping with? And the 2 points that I want to reflect on are, firstly, to highlight the need for some caution in how community resilience might be co-opted for political expediency. And secondly, how community resilience is a demonstration of compassion in action. This highlights not only the role that it can have locally within communities, but potentially what it offers to how we think about connected human systems in which compassion is positioned as a radical value in driving action. And I think that what we can learn from community resilience need not just be local or micro, but it can also be part of influencing structural changes to ameliorate the complex problems that we face. So to my first point, while we have seen that community resilience has been widely praised in many different settings in being a lifeline for communities in adversity, there have also been pockets of criticism about how stories of community resilience can be cynically co-opted for political expediency. And we see that there can be a fast cycle of celebrating resilience and then moving on. And this celebration of how well communities are doing and supporting each other to get by can be simultaneously used to potentially distract from the lack of structural action being taken to further protect these communities. As Humbert and Joseph argue, we can understand this romanticizing of resilience as a type of neoliberal governance, where governments increasingly outsource responsibility to individuals and communities and govern from a distance, obfuscating the need for broader structural change. If community resilience operates as breathing equipment in a fire, then it's playing a vital role. But returning to the debate about definitions, it needs to operate as a complement to structural action. Changes, for example, in government policies and macroeconomic support need to accompany what's going on, and it should not be a substitute in the absence of structural action. So while community resilience can also focus attention on advocating for these structural changes, often what we observe is that while they may have the attention of the media and political decision makers, their energy is likely absorbed more in getting by in immediate adversity. And this was powerfully echoed by Kate Schreid writing in The Guardian just last week about Lismore. But even having said that, I do think that what we are learning is that community resilience can play an important role in advocating for broader change. And I'd like to turn to this now as I finish up. When I think about what these 2 case studies that I presented have in common, key to what made a difference to the young people involved, both as peer supporters and beneficiaries, was that they minded about what was happening to others like them. And they felt others were aware of what was happening to them. They were connected through their shared circumstances, and the mutual recognition strengthened them, but also offered mechanisms for support, which made them feel better equipped to deal with the next thing. It fostered trust that with others, they themselves could probably cope. So in minding, it highlights the social connection between these individuals who might otherwise have been strangers. And in so doing, it also illuminates the presence and fundamental power of human systems. In minding, this demonstrates an absence of ambivalence. And this minding, on account of their social connectedness, instigated action. So the support extended through these interventions by peers was distinct from what might be found in friendship between individuals, which may be driven more by loyalty and intimacy. Instead, they were minded to act through their connected circumstances, driven by the concept of their commonality, their shared humanity in facing potential shared and similar suffering, more than by having a pre-existing individual relationship. So this sense of connectedness generated compassion, which in turn promoted trust and further action. And this maps onto the key elements which are encapsulated within Goetz's definition of compassion, the awareness of suffering coupled with the desire to relieve that suffering. And this is broken down further by others into 4 stages. The first, noticing the suffering of others. The second, interpreting that pain and suffering. Third, the empathic understanding and concern for others. And fourth, and critically, action to alleviate the suffering. And as Desmond Tutu said, compassion is not just feeling with someone, but seeking to change the situation. I read this extract in a paper reflecting on the 2019 bushfires, and it's an extract from an email sent by Judith Leeson to the author while the fires are ongoing. And she talks about how it was the unexpected acts of kindness are more motivating, and these informal expressions of how we value the contribution of our neighbours, communities, and each other have the capacity to inspire, encourage, and reinforce our ability to contribute to the general good. Compassion and caring are the keys to change, and targeted acts of kindness are a motivating force. It really highlighted to me that community resilience exposes and is evidence of the strength of our interconnections. And I'd like to extend this a bit further by drawing a connection with a commentary published in The Lancet by Liz Grant and colleagues in July this year, which made me think about how the interconnectedness demonstrated by community resilience can illuminate broader patterns of connection and action. Liz Grant and others argue that we need to place values as the drivers of the Sustainable Development Goals, and that compassion could be the radical value that sits at the center of this repositioning. To give you a bit more context, this commentary was in part a response to a position argued by Richard Horton, the editor-in-chief of The Lancet back in 2014, when he argued that an intrinsic failure within the articulation of the Sustainable Development Goals was the failure to emphasize the intentional togetherness and ability to alleviate suffering, which is at the heart of the Sustainable Development Goals. And in Liz Grant's commentary, she, with her colleagues, argues that we need to focus more on the experience of a common humanity, which leads us to compassion and creates space for trust and care. They present compassion as embedded within connections and partnerships. They draw on Gilbert's conceptualization of compassion, and they argue that compassion facilitates cooperation, which serves to protect the vulnerable by supporting and enacting social connectedness, which is necessary to nurture human flourishing. And what I take from that is that I think it's really helpful to help elucidate what is the blood that pumps through the veins that connects the various Sustainable Development Goals. The complexity of the design of these goals, which speaks to our interlocking concerns, has both been lauded as a strength for its engagement with systems, but has also been criticized for not capturing the world's imagination by effectively explaining what binds the concern for physical and human sustainability together. So here, they're arguing that compassion is what flows through and connects the vision of the Sustainable Development Goals, and is what connects human sustainability and physical sustainability. And to me, this echoes much of the literature on community resilience and what I've tried to draw out of our case studies, that these capacities or ingredients are already demonstrated in communities on the front lines, or those who bear the brunt of massive global challenges. For example, in Southern Africa, amongst young people living with HIV, forging their own systems of support and care, or indeed here in the Northern Rivers. And that learning to recognize what these qualities are can feed into making broader systemic changes centered on principles of compassion. And in the commentary, they go on to outline a framework to support compassion in action. And one example is creating pathways for compassion in action, incorporating practices that include careful listening, commitment to equality in partnerships, endurance in overcoming obstacles, and being patiently present in addressing conflict that is inherent in navigating global challenges. So I argue that compassion emerges through the recognition of social connection, and this creates trust to strengthen social connection and promotes resilience through relational connectedness, which in turn fosters energy and confidence in action for change. So I want to conclude by suggesting that compassion is a mechanism in sustaining community resilience, but it might also be a means to harness the connection between people and across systems. As Liz Grant argues, partnerships that are premised on compassion provide the strongest systems, services, and communities for humanity. So my concluding slide, what can community resilience do? So there's much to be valued in investing in community mental health, but we also need to support stretched resources. And that requires protective investment. For example, if we are going to invest in peer supporters, we have to make sure that they're okay and they're okay for the long term. And community resilience need not just be local or micro. It can be part of influencing structural changes to ameliorate the complex problems that we face. And I think that it also illuminates actionable impact of compassion. And this enables us to extend beyond the potentially narrow lens of resilience, beyond shocks, to supporting transformative adaptation and engender action for structural change and supportive, mutually reliant systems. I'm just gonna, those are the references that I've been referring to. And that's the end of my talk.
That's wonderful, Sarah. Thank you so much. What a fascinating topic. And thank you for sharing with us those amazing case studies. So I'm going to open it up to the floor now. If people have a question, please feel free to write in the chat or unmute and ask Sarah a question. Okay, well, perhaps while people are thinking about that, Sarah, I might jump in. I have got a million questions to ask.
I'm happy to kick off. Thanks. To kick off. So thanks, Sarah. That's really very, very interesting.
Sorry, Ross, go ahead. Ross, I think you have connection problems.
Michelle's also messaged, so she can't seem to
Yeah.
unmute.
Ross, can you hear us? Do you want to try again?
Yeah. Yeah, I can hear you. Can you hear me now?
You're really breaking up, Ross. Do you want to maybe type your question in the chat? Oh, it looks like Michelle might be able to unmute now. Michelle, can you hear us?
Do you want me to have another go? Can you hear me now?
Yeah, can hear you now.
You can hear me? You can hear me? So, sorry, I think we've just got a dodgy connection there. Yeah. So yeah, let me know if you can't hear me. So I was saying thanks, Sarah. That was a very really fascinating presentation. I wondered about the particularly in relation to your discussion of what breaks it, what breaks community resilience, and the role of politics and perceptions of national self-interest in that. And I started thinking about this when you were talking about the migrants, the youth migrants in South Africa, and I understand that there's just recently a push to repatriate refugees and migrants, and that's exacerbating an existing kind of sense of resentment amongst many community South Africans towards these migrants, mostly from other African countries. And so that sort of the political messaging around that is obviously it's not compassionate, and so it's kind of undermining one of your major sort of things that you're arguing is supporting resilience, and in fact, it's it's quite destructive. And similarly, I'm just thinking about the politics in Australia in the context of climate-related natural disasters, where particularly the previous government messaging was so against doing anything substantial against climate change, and that I expect undermined resilience to some extent. So I was just interested in your comments on the role of sort of politics and perceptions of national interest in the context of the concept that you're.
Yeah, thank you, Ross. So the first point in relation to kind of the migration policies in South Africa, which are increasingly regressive, or at least kind of hostile to migrants. I think that's a real threat in terms of what's breaking it. And I guess what we're trying to do to some extent is operate at different levels of scale of community. And so that notion before of visibility being negative and risky, but trying to create spaces and virtual spaces, I guess, through that those relationships with people they can trust that can counter that. But absolutely, we're always kind of in these situations seem to be working against the prevailing conditions, which are there to undermine and corrode the resilience that can be built up. And the founder of Jandiri, working in Zimbabwe, I know that's not what you were referring to in terms of the case studies, but she was saying that one of the things that she often thinks about is it's sort of creating protection in spite of the broader environment. And so there's always that tension and threat is very real. And I think it makes an enormous fragility to community resilience. And then secondly, I guess the other point that you were mentioning around the kind of politics around disinvestment or reluctance to invest, or active hostility to investing in mitigating kind of climate change effects through policy. I agree with you, and I think that's what I was also suggesting, that we need to be quite cautious about celebrations of community resilience if they're used in ways which are seeking to distract from that lack of action. And of course, it also undermines the imagined future about how it could be different. But I guess what I was also trying to argue is that the energy that it might be able to create in these more small clustered ways can still be quite productive for leveraging against that political inaction and helping against the feeling of hopelessness. I hope that responds to some of your points.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you hear me?
Yes, could you hear me?
Yeah. I'm not sure where the bad connection is. I think it might be with Ross, but I just want to follow up on the points that Ross was raising a bit around climate change. I've been listening to you talking, Sarah, about this notion of community resilience and mental health in the context of climate change, and thinking about chronic disease and your case studies looking at HIV, and thinking that there's some similarities there in terms of climate change, like an extreme weather event, like a flood, more and more is becoming part of a kind of chronic crisis type condition where it's not a one-off event, it's a series of events, and there's a sort of cumulative impact over time that we're seeing. And that these are not now anymore unexpected events, they're becoming more expected, if you like, which also feels more like managing a chronic condition. And it's probably not going to end. And in your presentation, Sarah, a couple of times you talked about learning to live with whatever. And I'm wondering if there are some parallels there with what we're seeing with extreme weather related events in the context of climate change, and whether there are lessons about building community resilience and our understanding of community resilience in the context of chronic disease that would be helpful to think about in the context of climate change and extreme weather related events?
I think absolutely, and that pattern of there being something which is shifting, and that the return to a previous time is not necessarily either feasible or after a while doesn't become constructive as a way of coping. And I think that one of the things that the chronic illness literature around resilience might be useful in thinking about climate change is that learning to live with is not necessarily a passive acceptance that what you are living with is static. So it's this notion that we can change what it is that we are living with as part of recognizing that what happened before isn't coming back. And so I think that idea of it being action orientated and actually a mechanism to sustain energy for action is also a particularly helpful part of how that might operate and apply in terms of climate related disasters. This notion of kind of overcoming being overwhelmed by the enormity of it. But it's not a passive acceptance that this is how this situation is always going to be, but it is a recognition that the situation that you're seeking to return to is not necessarily the most constructive course of action. And chronic illness has, I think, quite a long history of working it within that direction with that lens, but also around action orientated focus as a result.
And what about what you've told us today in terms of compassion and how that's your kind of radical ingredient really that helps with some of these mechanisms? Do you think that that's relevant in the context of climate change?
Well, I guess I was just trying to use it as the case studies as a micro example of how that relational connection, which offers both a kind of strength of a social safety net, but also can be a space through which energy and action are fostered and supported and sustained, then I think that that notion of why you're connected, and it's not just because you know each other in your intimate kind of friendships, but that you recognize, you see yourself in others, and you see that mutual dependency. I think that the compassion in that broadest way is a helpful way of thinking about systems thinking, and the reliance, the mutual reliance we have on all sorts of systems, which is not a new idea in any way. But I guess what this commentary is trying to argue is that we need a better way of explaining it, a better way of helping it resonate at a micro right up to the macro, and thinking about compassion, which is about minding enough to act as a result of your social connectedness or some form of connectedness and reliance. I think it's just interesting to think about how peer support operates, and operates as an antidote to ambivalence, and thinking about that, for example, in Lismore, and then thinking about that on a broader scale. So it's not a new concept, and I know it may not seem very radical, but I thought it really resonated with me what they were arguing in terms of systems thinking and how that could operate. If I saw that operating in terms of mental health at a reasonably small level, and thinking about that all the way up.
Thanks, Sarah. Lots of food for thought there. Any other questions, anyone? Okay. Well, Sarah is contactable through the University Centre for Rural Health. So if you do have a question that occurs to you afterwards, I'm sure Sarah would be delighted to hear from you. As I said at the beginning, we have been recording this session, so we'll make sure it's available as a podcast on the UCRH's website. So thank you so much for coming, Sarah, and for that fascinating presentation. And thank you everybody for attending today.
Thank you. Bye.